Right, so here we go. If you Google the afterlife images, you get all sorts of stuff like this, beautiful, tranquil rivers or sunlight beaming through the clouds. I'm just going to say a little bit about why it interests me particularly. Well, A, I'm getting old, and B, I used to do autopsies, and as a medical student, you have to do, back in the 70s, I had to do human dissection. And then later on, after I qualified, I thought about doing pathology. So I did a whole lot of autopsies, postmortems, and you can't be buried up to your elbows in a dead body without thinking about the difference between the dead and the living and what happens after death, if anything. So I think it was something that was important to me to at least have to be immersed in death, if you like. And then thirdly rather, as having been through the evangelical church in my 20s, the very, very strong kind of ideas of heaven and hell and who's going where were, profoundly affecting and quite troubling, really, as you can imagine. I feel differently about it now, but we had a few years ago, we had a clergy discussion group about heaven and hell, which I led, and it was interesting. I might say that later, what the group of clergy and ministry team readers and so on came up with about their ideas of hell in particular. Okay, so here we go. It's interesting to know that although human beings have buried one another for some millennia, only about 10 or 12,000 years ago did humans bury their dead with artifacts, such as beads made of basalt, which were thought to help them on the other side, whatever that meant to them. Sociological surveys in Europe and North America show that about 70 to 80% of people believe in some kind of afterlife, even atheists. And what they did was they put a kind of fictional scenario to a whole load of people. I'm talking, thousands of subjects. And it was a little story like, Bill had a car crash and he just had a row with his wife, and then he got killed in the car crash. And the question was, do you believe that after his death, Bill would regret having the row with his wife, and do you think he'd be aware that he was dead? Which is not exactly a definition of afterlife, but would, gave the psychologists who did the study a sense of that some people believed that once the brain was dead, there was still something after that. And then animal studies are quite interesting, that elephants and dolphins seem to be fascinated by corpses of their kin, and chimpanzees seem to have rituals around their dead mates. I always think with these kind of things, what does it matter what I or any of you, with all due respect, or anybody else thinks about it? On what basis are we forming our opinions? If you asked 100 people about the afterlife, or lack of it, I can guarantee that absolutely every single one would have an opinion about it, adults anyway, and not many people would say, I've got no idea. I suppose some people would say, I've got no idea. But anyway, I think, we all have opinions about these kinds of things, maybe based on our own cultural upbringing, our religious beliefs or lack of, and so on and so forth. So you might think, well, why do we need to talk about it really? Where are we going to draw any evidence to have a rational discussion? And you have to say at the end of the day, it's difficult to be utterly rational unless you completely or even partially subscribe to certain religious beliefs and texts. A key question is, what is consciousness? In science, consciousness is called the hard problem. Now, how is it possible that our brain, just some wet tissue, can hold our sense of being and existence? And then when we die, what happens to that consciousness? Is it possible it survives? And I think many people do believe consciousness survives. Or maybe we more loosely talk about a soul or spirit that's within us surviving. What does that mean? You know, what are we actually saying about that? If we say we have a soul and it survives, I sometimes think about Coronation Street in this regard, and I think if I watched an episode of Coronation Street on the telly and then I died shortly after, would I remember that episode of Coronation Street into the afterlife, whatever nature it takes? Or as in the Greek idea that you have you take with you your consciousness and then you drink from the river Lethe, I think it is, and then you forget, that makes you forget all that happened in your life. And so then I think, well, if you forget everything, what's the point of existence? You know, what we develop and grow as we live. Anyway, that's a whole other thing, really. And of course, most religions have afterlife beliefs and descriptions, either in the scriptures or handed down. And many of them, well, quite a lot of them, especially obviously Christian and some other religions, Islam and a few others, have reward or punishment for one's conduct during life, couched in some terms. You know, although I'm not going to be able to go through every kind of afterlife belief of all sorts of different religions. It would just take too long, but I have been looking through them, well, albeit on Wikipedia, I have to confess, but it is an interesting, you know, there's such diversity, and you think, crikey, you know, how did all these ideas come about? Where did they come from? Well, we could obviously talk about that later. Is there any science? I mentioned the hard problem of consciousness, just even knowing what that is, and wondering if it might survive in beyond death, you know, and people who are in persistent vegetative state and who are assumed to be dead, suddenly having, you know, coming back to life and things like that. And then I will say a little bit more about near-death experiences, or NDE, in a few minutes, because they're tremendously interesting, and wherever they are in the world, you know, where studies have been done all over the world, and people who survived death or near death or resuscitated, had a cardiac arrest, that kind of thing. The kind of things people report when they come round are really quite similar. But I'll say more about that in a minute, as I said. This is just a study in Canada. Just it's fairly representative of life after death beliefs done a couple of years ago, and I've blocked in the kind of summary of all ages. Do you believe in life after death? 66%. In heaven, 63%. In hell, significantly lower. Contact with the spirit world, half of the people. Can we communicate with the dead? Almost half the people. And there is, as you see, some variation, and depending on what age you are, whether you're a millennial, ex-boomer, or pre-boomer, whatever that is. You know, there are some varieties of figures, but I use this Canadian study just as an example, because pretty much around the world, different studies about life after death beliefs um, are pretty similar. I can't remember how many people were sampled in this. I'm pretty sure it was hundreds or thousands, but other studies have shown very similar figures. In some ways, in other cultures in the States and Europe, I think the life after death belief is a bit higher. As I said at the beginning, maybe 70 to 80, but it obviously varies. It might be how they frame the question and what people understand by life after death anyway. It's not an easy thing to study. Okay, so now here's the kind of absolute, a little kind of graph of, or flow chart, if you like, of our subject. So pretty obviously, we live and then we die. And quite a lot of people think that's it, there's nothing. So I thought about this artwork by Damien Hirst of the shark in a formaldehyde or formalin tank. And the title of that is The Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And I don't know if you know, but Damien Hirst is a bit obsessed with death, and a lot of his works are, maybe there's one I recall of dead butterflies and stuff like that, all sorts of things related to death as well as medicines and health. And I guess for most people, to imagine not existing is really mind-manglingly difficult. Although, of course, I don't remember anything before about the age of 3, and that's quite a common 3 or 4. You don't think of what life was like before that. You can't imagine being a fetus, mentally speaking. So, I think people can be troubled by the prospect of nothingness and annihilation at death, at brain death. So that's one thing. Some people, of course, and some religions in particular, in Eastern religions, believe in reincarnation. As I said earlier, I kind of a bit loath to talk about something I know very little about, of some of the other religious beliefs related to death. But clearly it's a completely different circular idea compared to the linear life and death and that's it idea in the West, particularly in the West. So reincarnation, coming back as another human being or as a creature, sometimes with some characteristics that relate to how you behaved in a previous life. You do sometimes come across people who say, yes, I was an Egyptian princess in, 500 BC or something, whenever Egypt started. And you think, well, why weren't they just ordinary people, slaving on the pyramids or something? Anyway, they're always princesses or pharaohs and things. I don't want to be cynical, but it's some people have incredibly, detailed accounts of what they were in the 18th century or whenever it was, but I don't have any anecdotes about that. Other people kind of have a sense of that there will be union with God, in inverted commas, or the God of the universe, some eternal spirit and nature. And sorry, I forgot to put up that rather jokey reincarnation idea of Johnny Depp. I think Benedict Cumberbatch has been, sorry, the Harry Potter chap there's lots of photographs of him in the ancient, from the Victorian era or Edwardian era, and they look just like him. But the idea of some kind of union with the universe is quite appealing to many people, I think. But exactly what that means is it's difficult to say. In the movie 2001, The Space Odyssey, which was one of my faves, there was a kind of fetus-like thing in a sphere. It was a next stage in the evolution of humankind who could flit around the universe looking at things. That rather appealed to me, I have to say. But more commonly is a sense of union with God. And then this is, to my mind, what most people, when they think of heaven, you know, when I do funerals, I just get the sense that, you know, he or she is in heaven, and it's like a direct transfer up to heaven or wherever heaven is. Maybe with a place of waiting. Some people talk about there's a garden where you meet your loved ones and that kind of thing. So what do people imagine when they think about heaven? Well, I'm just going to show you a clip of a Robin Williams film, which got it wasn't panned exactly, but it didn't get great reviews, called What Dreams May Come. And I went to see it at the cinema. It was about 1998, and it's just curious. It's like a Hollywood take on heaven, and I thought that must be interesting to watch. It is a bit cringe-worthy in places, but you know, at least it tried to represent what people think heaven is like through some folk ideas. And Robin Williams, in the first bit, meets his dog, and he says at one point, you know, I've screwed up. I ended up in dog heaven. Anyway, let's have a little look at the clip. I hope this works all right.
Screwed up. I'm in dog heaven. That's where we all go. Can't be bad, can it, girl? Maybe I'm not in your heaven after all, girl. Maybe you're in mine.
And this is still from the same movie. I couldn't find a high quality clip, but he ends up on some sort of massive steps and looks out over heaven, where actually all the souls have gone. And this might be people's idea, people flying around with flappy outfits on, and even umbrellas by the look of it. A bit strange. And you know, distant city, maybe Jerusalem, Zion, the New Zion, the New Jerusalem or something. Anyway, you get the picture of that's Hollywood's kind of idea of people's idea of heaven. Obviously, there are a lot of jokes about heaven and cartoons, so I just picked out a few. Sorry about this, I died at a costume party. God, this is boring. fate, worse than death, and that's from Family Guy. Brian dies and it ends up talking to, I think that's Kurt Cobain and Van Gogh and Ernest Hemingway, all having a drink. So people make fun of the ideas that people have, and I think that's why we've got to be careful about when we talk to people about these ideas. Now, coming back to heaven and just representing it in a rather formal sort of graphical way. Obviously, friends in the Catholic Church have an idea of dying in the state of grace, entering purgatory. Limbo is a bit more complex, and that does appear in some Catholic kind of ideas, especially in the past. A place of shades, a bit like Jewish Sheol. But anyway, you wouldn't have, or the kind of more, Protestant idea that the saved and the righteous go straight to heaven, do not pass go, do not pay £200. And I put the word universal there, and that's quite not an uncommon idea that everyone ends up there eventually. But we might discuss that later. The universal salvation, and if there is a afterlife and heaven, that we end up there. Everybody ends up there, even Hitler or whoever. It's difficult to explain in a few words, but there we go. Then some people, sorry, that's I can't see that because it just the resurrection and bodily resurrection to a bodily form is quite a common idea, that we eventually end up, like Jesus is depicted after the resurrection, forever and ever and ever. But others have a more kind of spirit soul idea floating around forever and ever. The new heaven and new earth, the end of Revelation. So that's even within the Protestant ideas and Catholic ideas, it varies depending on what you believe. And now the other place, as they say, that common ideas in several religions is some sort of judgment. And then the unsaved and unrighteous, as just to use terms that people use, you at the day of judgment, you're damned forever. And this is hell, obviously. And I put an asterisk by hell as to what one might mean. Some people say it's immediate annihilation to nothing, or it's a place of nothingness. It's the place you choose. It's kind of outer darkness, fire, torment, eternal separation from God, eternal conscious torment. And that's where, it's such a troubling picture, really, for any thinking Christian, or anybody really who is concerned about what we're talking about here, eternal conscious torment. This is a picture of Dante being shown around hell, basically, in Dante's Inferno. He's being shown around by Virgil. I haven't read it, but we're familiar with it. Actually, the lowest circle of hell, the worst place, is freezing cold and not boiling hot. It's interesting. So, and there are things like a second death terminology, and then there's delayed annihilation. Anyway, some people, talk about if there is a hell, there's a possibility of redemption. And surprisingly, C.S. Lewis, in his book The Great Divorce, had this idea that people could, if they were ended up in hell, which wasn't a burning place, it was a lot of a huge, great suburbia, kind of grey town, and you could go on a bus trip to heaven, just to check it out, and you can stay there if you want. But a lot of people don't want, they wanted what they wanted. So it's an interesting thing for discussion. This is the overall chart, so I won't dwell on that. It's just everything I've just more or less said. So obviously, as a Christian, I think, checking out the Bible for what it's got to say. What do we know about heaven? Well, Jesus said no one's ascended into heaven except the one who descended, the Son of Man himself. I've come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. These things call into question what Jesus meant by heaven when he said these things. Your reward's great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets, and now they're persecuting you, so you end up in heaven. And this, I do rather like Paul's verse, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. The flip side of that is what God has prepared for those who don't love him, but more about that later. And Peter, or the writer of 2 Peter, it may not be Peter, according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. They of those times had a more physical picture of what heaven was like, new heaven and a new earth, as at the end of Revelation. I was one more, and talking of Revelation, there's some rather graphic descriptions of heaven, which are rather nice. But then this is hell. As for the cowardly, the faithless, detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, lake of fire that burns with fire and sulfur, which is second death. Jesus said, do not fear those who kill the body, but those who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. And end of Matthew's Gospel, these will go away to eternal punishment, those who haven't done good. There's a mixture of salvation and doing good works in the Gospels. Now, this looks a bit like Greenwich Foot Tunnel, but it's just an image on the near-death experience, which I want to sort of close with. I might just go fairly quickly over these, but for about 10 to 20% of people who have come close to death, or had a cardiac arrest, something similar, report a near-death experience. Some Buddhists report near-death experience during meditation, or the type of characteristics which I'll show you in a moment, and some out-of-body experiences which are common in near-death experience. Floating above your own body may occur with certain drugs. I think LSD and psilocybin, I can't remember, and certain psychological experiments that pretend you've got an extra limb, and I won't go into them, but they can make people feel like they're in another body. What do people get with a near-death experience? And these, as I said earlier, they're very common things all over the world where people have had near-death experiences. Sense awareness of being dead, peace, well-being and painlessness, positive emotions, sense of removal from the world, an out-of-body experience of some kind, some perception from above, particularly observing medical professionals doing resuscitation. Some intensive care units have put shells under the ceiling that nobody can see unless you float it up and look down, if you get what I mean. But to my knowledge, I don't think anyone's proven that the resuscitated person has seen something that they couldn't possibly have seen unless they were truly floating above the body. It's the temporal, I think it's the temporal region of the brain which is said to be active in all these kind of out-of-body experiences. And then tunnel, darkness, going towards through a passageway or a staircase, movement towards light, or a being of light who communicates with you. All those are quite common things. And an intense feeling of unconditional love and acceptance. At my previous church, so one of the members there, was also a friend, he had a near-death experience, and he said it changed his life. He just felt all these things. But sometimes there are negative things, sensations of anguish and distress. I think that's quite rare, but anyway, it does happen in some people. Beings of light being encountered, beings dressed in white, all those sorts of things. And more important, in some ways, for doing funerals, the possibility of being reunited with deceased loved ones. Uncle Fred died, but now he's with Auntie Mabel, and isn't that great? And it's great comfort to people. That idea. Seeing your life flash before your eyes, I think that's less common. And approaching a border or some decision about whether to go back. I mean, obviously they made the decision to go back or got pulled back into their body, otherwise they wouldn't be able to say what happened, but occasional reluctance. And then suddenly waking up in your body. There seems to be in research, which is difficult to do, but some connection to whatever you believe before you had this near-death experience dictate the phenomena up to a point. But even so, a lot of people seem to have things that they've never thought about dying, and now all these things happen. They had no cultural ideas. And then afterwards, like my friend in my last church, a sense of peace, change in their lives, and so on. I won't dwell on this, but just to show there are research studies published in reasonable journals, and this relates to something called REM intrusion, that people who have some sort of waking hallucinations or dreaming, daydreaming, proper dreams during the day. This is called REM intrusion, rapid eye movement intrusion. It's not a pop group. And people who have some things in life tend to have more, according to this study, have more near-death experiences. So what they're saying is that maybe certain people are pre-primed to have a near-death experience because of the nature of their brain. I mentioned research in the US and Europe in intensive care units and so on, with hidden targets for the so-called dead person to look at before they end up not being dead. And I did mention earlier this LSD and other drugs and psychological tests, sorry, it's like repetitive line there, can cause out-of-body experiences. Just to finish with some literature around afterlife. Obviously, most of us were aware of the Bible. Other scriptures have descriptions. The Great Divorce I mentioned earlier, I would recommend that if you never read it. It just helped me a lot. Love Wins by Rob Bell is a fairly recent book where he basically, I think he used to be an evangelical, mega evangelical in the States, and kind of changed his mind really about a lot of things. And he's really almost a universalist. I think it's a very easy to read book. You can read it in about 2 hours, like all his books. But it's an analysis of the scriptures, the Bible scriptures anyway. A History of the World in 10.5 chapters. There's a chapter there where a chap dies and goes to heaven, and basically he's totally selfish but has a great time having as much sex and food and golf and everything as he wants. And then after about 10,000 years of playing golf with a perfect score, he gets fed up with it and asks to be annihilated. Julian Barnes is an atheist, I think, and he wrote a very moving book about his wife's death, as I recall. But he was kind of playing on the whole afterlife mythology as he saw it. The Lovely Bones is a rather creepy book about a girl who got murdered and other things, and gazing down on earth from heaven or some kind of intermediate place. David Mitchell is I think he's an atheist, but he writes, Cloud Atlas has sort of reincarnation ideas in it, the bone clocks, about ideas about souls. It's a while since I've read them, but he's a very good writer. And something I haven't read, The Divine Comedy, is by Dante. But I did see a movie when I was a kid about hell, and it really disturbed me. You know, huge, great flames and people being trapped in chambers of fire and stuff. Anyway, that's obviously Dante, the section of the Divine Comedy called Inferno, sort of medieval ideas. So time really for some discussion. I haven't put up any discussion points, but I thought we should just have a free-flowing discussion on anything you like. And I haven't got any answers, so let me stop the share.